Robert, how did you get into astrology?
Well, back in 1971, I moved from Santa Monica to Cleveland, Ohio, and I wound up becoming housemates with this guy and his girlfriend, and the guy's mom was an astrologer, and she calculated my chart and interpreted it for me, and it was so accurate I asked her to teach me.
Wow. And what has your focus been in astrology? We have all these different kinds of astrologers, like Hellenistic astrologers and evolutionary astrologers and Vedic astrologers. What's been your focus?
Well, I was attracted to the writings of Alan Leo and Charles Carter in the 1970s, and so I'd have to say the British astrologers from the 1890s through the 1940s was my primary influence, and I have a lot of respect for, especially for CEO Carter and his work.
How would you define astrology just to someone you met on the street that didn't know anything about it?
I look at it as the Holy Ghost in the Trinity. I feel that astrology is a necessary language that connects heaven with earth. And I was raised and educated Roman Catholic, and there was always this question about the mysterious Holy Ghost. You had God the Father, which was the divinity, and God the Son, which was the humanity. And then what was this mysterious third part of the Trinity? And so in reading the book of Genesis about how God placed lights in the firmaments of the heavens to mark the days and the nights and the seasons and to record time, it just evolved when I was in my 20s of astrology being essentially a language of the Holy Spirit.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that there is a spiritual life force that permeates astrology, and I believe that if you're using astrology with the intention set in your heart to help other people, it's empowered spiritually. But like anything that can heal or harm, there's also a shadow side or a dark side to the usage of astrology. So I see it as a spiritual force that, if it's used properly, can be of tremendous assistance to people.
Wow. And how has your astrology impacted your life, not only as a career, but personally?
Well, gosh, I've used my own birth chart and my own progressions and transits to make major decisions. I wrote my first book on progressions and started my publishing company at my Saturn opposition at 1998 at the age of 44. And I had a goal of writing 7 books from then until my second Saturn return at age 59. And also, ever since my progressed sun entered into Capricorn about 17 years ago, I got very serious with my practice. And when my Mars progressed into his dignity in Scorpio, I found that I had an improvement in my willpower, and that kind of coincided with the writing of the books, was the Mars progressing into Scorpio.
So it seems that from your answer that you really track your own cycles and really use it in your own life as a tool, a guide.
Yes, very much so, especially the house position of the progressed moon and the house position of transit Saturn. Those two have been probably the guideposts for me throughout my career.
Yeah, a lot of astrologers just getting into it don't really know the importance of the progressed moon. It's not really played up a lot in books, but it's very important, huh?
I've had an unusual occurrence of transit Saturn forming repeated aspects to the secondary progressed moon since 1989. And the Saturn orbital cycle is 29 and a half years, and the progressed moon takes 27 years and 4 months to cycle through the chart. But because they accelerate and slow down in their motions, sometimes you can get the transit of Saturn locking into forming repeated aspects with the progressed moon. I've had that going on since 1989, and when it's all over, I'll have had 43 oppositions of transit Saturn and my progressed moon from 1989 until 2011. So I've been going through this now for almost 20 years with a few more years to go. And what was interesting was the month that started, the very first Saturn transit opposition to the progressed moon, was the month I became a full-time self-employed astrologer in July of 1989.
And what advice could you give the new student of astrology who's trying to make that transition into being professional? For instance, how do they overcome some of the nervousness before a client comes?
Well, you know, I wrote a book, a handbook for the self-employed astrologer in my volume 3, and I had a whole chapter in there about making the transition from student to professional. And I wrote about confidence being one of the most important factors that's involved in why intermediate to advanced astrology students sometimes hesitate to practice. And I wrote about the ascendant and how if you can approach your astrology practice through the qualities of your rising sign, I believe that the full manifestation of the first house, and especially its ruler through the ascendant, is how someone can really tap into their confidence. And so I had a section in the book about that. And also, by setting the intention in your heart to use astrology to love and serve people, it's sort of a moral equivalent to the ethical training that we get through the national organizations now. I don't see how a person can go wrong if they set that intention in their heart to use astrology to help others.
I often sort of pray, meditate before a client comes, and just ask the universe to guide me, to guide them.
Yes. And then I think that's what we were talking about a little bit earlier. If astrology is the Holy Spirit or the Holy Ghost in action, connecting divinity with humanity, astrologers become celestial translators for people's planetary influences. And there's a spiritual responsibility in communicating the horoscope to the client. And I think just like medicine, where what is done by the physician can either heal or harm, I believe astrologers are in a similar role. That astrological information can be used in a negative and destructive way, and it also can be used in a positive and uplifting way.
Isn't there an old quote by Hippocrates about astrology and physicians?
I think Paracelsus in the dictum that was given to physicians to do no harm, that may be where that comes from, and I guess also the Hippocratic Oath also speaks to that.
In terms of the Holy Spirit, I was reminded of the disciples and the 12 tongues of flame above their heads when the Spirit came upon them after that, and then it was sort of like the blessing of the Spirit, and then also the Sophia wisdom aspect of God, the feminine, and being like the sort of invisible fabric of the universe that sort of binds everything together. Do you have any words about Sophia or any of those things?
Yes, I think in modern times we've had our society transition into a secular and humanistic culture, and the influence of religion, or especially organized religion, has really waned. And many of the individuals in my generation, the Pluto and Leo baby boomer generation that had Neptune and Libra, they really had this sense of cultural romanticism, which I think is a Neptune and Libra archetypal phenomenon, and they turned to other religions to find their truth and find their peace. So you have many people in that generation of souls born from the early 40s into the middle to late 1950s that turned to Tibetan Buddhism or to Hinduism or any of the Eastern mystical teachings. So I think what's happened with astrologers in modern times is that we get condemnation from the academic and the scientific and the religious communities, and also society at large, I think, because of the secular trend in society, doesn't understand the priestly role of the astrologer. In some ways, the laws of supply and demand that are making professional astrologers so much more in demand now, I think is a direct result of the secular trends in society over the last 30 years.
Yeah, it seems like a lot of people have an emptiness, a hungering for a deeper kind of life, and yet all there is consumerism fed to them, and these false sort of political struggles, and it's like, but the government of the self would be about getting into your own chart and understanding your archetypes and becoming your own, in a sense, a hero in the journey.
I think Stephen Arroyo expressed this very well when he wrote that book on practicing the cosmic science, and that originally was published as The Practice and Profession of Astrology. And he talked about individuals wanting to feel that connection to the divine. They wanted to feel that connection to the cosmos. And so the spiritual role that the professional astrologer plays is we remind people of their blueprint that we can see in the birth chart. We remind them of the unfolding of the soul growing into its full capacity through the progressed horoscope. And we help them to cope with the fated circumstances in life by explaining their transits to them. And we can also help them to understand the relationships, using synastry and composite charts. And so the range of assistance that the professional astrologer can provide for the client is virtually unlimited. And I think that modern society has become so secular and so consumer-oriented, there's a lot of spiritual emptiness in present-day society, and astrologers are filling that gap in a similar way that the priestly class used to do in earlier times.
Like in Persia with the Magi. That's why I'm calling this Return of the Magi.
Yes. I had a school of astrology in Lake Oswego, Oregon for 10 years, and if you got outside of Portland, the metropolitan area, it would get conservative and rural in a hurry. And I got classes that I was teaching at Portland Community College were canceled by letters of complaints from fundamental Christians to the president of the college. And I also had a lot of clients that were raised as Jehovah's Witnesses or in fundamentalist Christian homes. And they were very curious about astrology, but they had been taught that it was wrong or it was evil or the work of the devil and so on. So I think any professional astrologer that establishes a visible public practice has to also be trained and skilled in how to deal with the condemnation that comes at you from the academic, the religious, and the scientific communities. In some ways, full-time professional astrologers become spokespersons for the profession in representing astrology to the public.
One of the visions for making this movie is to sort of change the perception of what astrology is in the world.
You're doing a good thing, Kelly, because the fact that this movie had its genesis, right? It's your third Jupiter return, and that launches a 12-year cycle of growth and opening up doors of opportunity. I think what you're doing now is going to pretty much have an impact until you're 47 years old and you get to your fourth Jupiter return.
Then I'll be making my fantasy movies, huh?
Yeah.
What's I going to say? Well, what is your favorite aspect of astrology? What fascinates you most about astrology that you'd like to convey to someone?
Well, I'd have to say progressions. I think that when I wrote my first book and tried to articulate a synthesis of the secondary and tertiary and minor progressions and how reality was operating on the physical and the astral and the causal level simultaneously at 3 rates of speed, for me, that established a multidimensional approach to astrology that I've tried to include in my subsequent books. And I was told in the 1970s by astrologers that I had spoken with when I first started studying astrology when I was in my late teens and early 20s, that because I was born at the waning square of Uranus to Neptune, and that was described by Dane Rujar and Alexander Ruperti as being the seed point of the subsequent cycle, I often felt that every astrologer had to know their generational contribution, and we could understand that through the outer planets, Saturn through Pluto, and any aspects that they were forming in the natal chart. So I think my specific generation, say born from late 53 into 1956 or 57 with Uranus in that waning square to Neptune, we were the ones that were kind of called on to incorporate mysticism and metaphysics and include that into some kind of coherent astrological language. And so for me personally, that's the model that I've tried to emulate throughout my career.
When I was getting inspired to make this film, I was watching that documentary, The Secret, and in it there's a lady who overcome cancer through laughter and getting back to enjoying life, and you've had some experience with that, huh?
Yes, I had my progressed sun arrive at a conjunction with my Chiron for 2 years, and at the same time, transit of Saturn stationed at 2504 Leo in December of 2006, and my natal Pluto was 2459, so I had Saturn stationing right on my Pluto by conjunction, and I had a diagnosis of colon cancer, a rectal tumor, and it was quite a shocking and serious thing. You have a life-threatening illness, and instantaneously your whole world changes. You have to rethink everything. And I think what the beauty of this whole experience has been is that I went public with my diagnosis. I made a mention of it in my electronic newsletter. And while I was undergoing the radiation treatments and taking the tablet chemotherapy and drinking the Essiac tea and doing both conventional and alternative means to try to get well, a lot of astrologers were praying for me and putting me into their prayer circles. And about 3 or 4 days after the Blast conference, I was scheduled to have surgery, and I was trying to fulfill all my speaking invitations, even while I was going through the radiation treatments, traveling here and there to fulfill lecture invitations. And we had the decision made not to go ahead with the surgery after I got the results of a PET scan that showed the tumor was completely gone, the inflammation had completely disappeared, and there was no trace of cancer in the lymph system or in the other parts of my body. So in some ways I feel like a miracle man, and really a huge debt of gratitude to the astrology community for all the love and prayers that were sent my way.
I was one of them, sending them, holding in my thoughts each day, and Moses too, and yeah, it's amazing, I think it's great, that even astrologers, Magi, who are outside of the, say, so-called religious strain, can still tap into that power of prayer. Prayer is not just for someone who's part of an organized religion.
If you have a strong Jupiter, a strong 12th house, or strong Neptune, or strong Pisces, there's this sense of the mystical dimensions of astrology that you're literally entering into a force field of light and sound that is being transported from the realm of the divine to the realm of the human. And I feel that for my personal understanding of astrology as a language of life, I see it as the Holy Ghost. I see it as what connects heaven and earth. It's a language that's designed to explain to people the spiritual dimensions of their life, the fabric of the soul, and how to cope with the circumstances of life that are fated. I tried to address that in my last book on holographic transits, looking at the space-time continuum as what we enter as we take birth in human form, and how free will and fate are correlated, or how they correspond with the space-time continuum, and how the time cycles of standard transits are what administers the fate after birth, and the holographic transits, which are the phase angle returns between the planets and the sun, are the spatial cycles that show us when we can align our free will with higher self. So I think that astrology is about to make a leap from the fourth dimension of its awareness of the time cycles into the fifth dimension, which is the awareness of spatial cycles. And I think we're right on the cusp of that. And one would think that when Uranus hits the cardinal point of 0 Aries, and then shortly after that Neptune goes into Pisces, into its dignity, we're going to see a massive exponential increase in the spiritual dimensions of astrology and start a whole new 84-year cycle of Uranian evolution, just like we did when Uranus entered into Aries in the late 1920s.
Mm-hmm. And you were talking about the blast, about that North Node Uranus conjunction in Pisces being a whole new 15-year cycle?
Yeah, I researched that to present at my lecture at the blast, and I wrote an article about it in my newsletter, that every 15 and a half years, Uranus and the North Node conjoin. And at that time, the future of astrology is seeded in some important way. So during the weekend of the blast conference, the Uranus-North Node conjunction was conjoined by Mercury, and they were all exact at the same time. In fact, right as I was giving my lecture, I think that triple conjunction perfected. And my interpretation of that was the young astrologers, symbolized by Mercury, are contributing over the next 15 and a half years a sophisticated intellectual synthesis, because Pisces, as the last of the mutable signs, represents intellectual synthesis. And this younger generation of astrologers in their 20s and 30s now, they've been exposed to modern Western psychological astrology. They've been exposed to Vedic astrology from India. They've been exposed to the heritage traditions of Hellenistic and medieval astrology, and they're putting together a synthesis of these different branches of the profession. So I think that they are really the ones that are going to carry the profession forward now over the next 15 years, and it's very exciting.
Well, we stand on the shoulders of giants.
And the talent pool, I think, when the baby boomers were wondering why weren't these younger astrologers coming to the conferences or attending the lectures at the local astrology groups, well, the truth was they're all hanging out online and chatting with each other in these internet chat rooms and Yahoo groups, and like this MySpace group, horoscopic astrology, has over 5,000 members. And you go there and you read some of their posts and you look at some of their chart interpretations, and they're very knowledgeable. For some of these young astrologers that are in their early 20s or middle 20s are just fabulous with the amount of technique that they've already mastered, and then their philosophical underpinnings of how astrology works is quite impressive.
Yeah, I guess in the old days you would read a book, or see a teacher. But now when you can click a link that takes you to one dimension of knowledge, and then link it to what you read yesterday or an hour before at another link. So it's a cross-pollination faster, accelerated cross-pollination of knowledge.
In the early 1970s, when I had to learn how to manually cast horoscopes using tables of houses and the ephemeris and the atlas, that showed the time changes, there was so much mental energy that was spent just mastering the calculation of the nativity, and the interpretation of the delineation of that was almost secondary. And now it's reversed. The astrology software programs that we've had for the personal computer over the last 25 years have allowed astrologers to be freed, especially the ones that are math intimidated, to focus more on delineation, on interpretation, and the art of chart interpretation. So it's very different now than it was just 35 years ago.
Yeah, I was just doing some research about history last night, and I had Wikipedia open, and anytime I had a solar fire astrology program, when things were lining up in the heavens, big planets, I would just see what year it was and then go type that number, that year, into Wikipedia, and then look at all the different events that happened and go, whoa!
That's right. Just a few years ago, I was doing the same things when I would write my mundane articles for my electronic newsletter, and I would use that book, The Timetables of World History by Bernard Grun.
Oh, yeah, I have it on my shelf in here. Yeah, it's a great one.
Now you can just go online and, like you say, type in a year, and you pretty much get the same summary of whatever happened then.
And the cool thing is, not only does it list it, it gives you a link to it so you can go find out more.
So tracking a cycle like the triple conjunctions of Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune, which occur about every 690 years, it used to be pretty laborious to go back and track what was happening in the 7th century or in the late 13th century to try to make sense out of that triple conjunction that occurred in the late 1980s. So I guess you could say that the younger generation of astrologers that have grown up with internet technology, they bring a level of research sophistication that was just unheard of as little as 20 years ago.
Yeah, one of my students last night said, when was the 0 degree tropical aligned with the 0 degree sidereal? And I said, oh, let's find out. And I opened a program, and it took me about an hour to figure it out, but I figured it out to the second.
Yeah.
The second, and I was like, wow.
Yeah.
I mean, the research capabilities are amazing. But also the spiritual connectedness of sort of the astrophysical revelations of things like the Hubble telescope. We're getting a larger sense of our universe, and and that is coming into play too. In the sense of the spiritual knowledge or realization that gives us.
If we look at the discovery of the 3 modern planets, Uranus in 1781 and Neptune in 1846 and Pluto as recently as 1930, and we go back and we read some of the classic texts on what we now attribute to Pluto used to be attributed to Saturn, what we now attribute to Neptune used to be attributed to Jupiter, and so on. I think what we're seeing is the return to the classical texts in the heritage traditions, using traditional rulerships, for example. Something as simple as somebody with Aquarius rising considering Saturn as the ruler, somebody with Pisces rising, considering Jupiter as the ruler, and Scorpio rising, looking at the sign of Mars as sort of the secondary nature of the rising sign. I think there's a lot of modern astrologers that don't claim to be traditional astrologers, but use some of the traditional techniques, such as dispositor trails and looking at mutual reception and soul and final dispositors. So I think this divide that we're seeing in modern astrology between the moderns and the traditionalists, I think we need to build some bridges there, where it's quite okay for someone to have a modern Western psychological orientation, but to underpin their chart work with traditional technique, impeccable technique that comes down through tradition. And I think we're going to see more of that, especially in this younger generation of astrologers.
Yeah, I feel like I'm learning Vedic astrology on one hand, and I'm learning Hellenistic on the other. Not to become that kind of astrologer, but to really soak myself into another culture and just really be enhanced, enriched by that culture's expression of their looking at the heavens,
That combination of impeccable technique and a philosophical or theoretical underpinning, I think, is the strength of Hellenistic and the other heritage traditions, because there was more thought put into the how and why of astrology. And what's happened, I think, in my opinion, in the last 25 years is the proliferation of computerized astrology has made calculation and technique almost putting it at the forefront, and then the other part of the astrologer's consciousness that is reflecting on the spiritual and philosophical and theoretical underpinning of astrology, the why does it work and the how does it work, that's been sort of set aside and suffered at the expense of the intense focus on calculations and technique.
Yeah, I like to emphasize the sort of the oracular dimension of astrology, that the astrologer is the lens, the translator, and it's coming through you, and it's not about you, it's just about you opening up and giving that information, and from a deep, pure spiritual lens place where it just ignites that person into total self-realization,
There's the joke amongst professional astrologers about the verbal rising self-employed astrologer that spends 4 hours doing prep work, in their first year of their practice, and taking copious pages of notes and summarizing the natal chart, summarizing all the transits, summarizing all the secondary progressions. And then when they get into the consultation, which is a 60 or 90-minute appointment with a client, they might wind up using 5 or 10 things on their 26 pages of notes on a legal pad, and then get thrown off guard when the client asks them a few specific questions. So I think that the marriage of technique and intuition, which only experience can bring, I think any practicing astrologer goes through an experiential curve where they get more confident, and then that informs the kind of prep work that they do prior to their professional appointments. There is this sense that why did you see this in the chart but not that? And how can you respond to the client when they ask you specific questions? If you have an agenda that you're trying to force all your prep work into the consultation because you think it's important for the client to know, versus listening to and being receptive to the questions that the client is asking and then adjusting your communication to address that, it's a big shift for astrologers earlier in their career to make it a client-centered focus, even when they do really demanding prep work before the appointment. I think this is really what separates astrologers from psychotherapists, is the prep work that we have to do prior to the appointment. And ideally that would be a time after we calculate and print the charts and then take our notes prior to the consultation, whether it's in person or over the phone, or whether we just make an interpretation for someone on a tape or a CD. is to view that prep work as the spiritual time. That's when we're bringing in the Holy Ghost. That's where we're tuning into the soul and the needs and the heart of the other person. And to almost look at that prep work that we do as a sacred time, it's a huge part of my practice.
It is for me too. I mean, I often get insights that need to be relayed to the client while I'm prepping, you know.
And everybody has a routine. Everybody puts together a method or a preparation routine as they get ready for their appointments. And I think that's when you were asking about the confidence. There's no substitution for experience. So if an intermediate to advanced student that's trying to transition into self-employment as a full-time professional astrologer, or even as a part-time astrologer, just to realize that setting the intention to use the astrology knowledge that you have to help the client, and then to view that prep time that you're doing before the appointment as a sacred time, I think is one way to gain that confidence.
And on a practical note, you wrote about setting up your business as a sole proprietorship.
Mm-hmm. Most astrologers, when they enter into self-employment, usually don't form a licensed limited corporation or a partnership of some sort. They usually just become a sole proprietor. In some states, you can register the name of your company, like Earthwalk School of Astrology, with the Department of State, in the state capital, and or get a city or county business license, and you're pretty much up and running. And I had a whole chapter in Volume 3, the Handbook for the Self-Employed Astrologer, where I talk about handling income, expenses, and taxes, and getting business licenses, and I kind of spelled that out in that third book.
Good. Thank you for that. It's needed.
I wrote that as a labor of love. I had progressed Mercury sextile my Venus while I wrote that manuscript. And I was also at my fourth Jupiter return, age 47 going on 48, when I started that book. And I basically talked about the 12 years since I had started becoming a full-time professional astrologer at age 35 at my third Jupiter return. So that book was sort of planned to coincide with my fourth Jupiter return.
Yeah.
Now it's in its second printing, and it's been published for about 6 years now.
In terms of, let's go back to your first book on progressions. A progression, what is a progression to the person that doesn't know anything about it?
Well, it's really a representation of the three natural celestial movements of time. The Earth orbits daily on its polar axis, and the Moon makes an annual rotation around the Earth as they both orbit annually around the Sun. So you have three time measurements of days, months, and years. And essentially progressions are just relationships, time relationships, where you're moving the horoscope one day for each year of life, or you're moving the horoscope one day for each lunar month of life, or you're moving the horoscope one lunar month for each year of life. And what I wrote about in Volume 1 on progressions was how do we interpret these three different systems of progressions. And I have a metaphysical theory in that book that shows one representing the unfolding on the causal plane, the minor progressions, the other the unfolding of consciousness on the astral plane, which are the tertiary progressions, and then the secondary progressions deal mostly with the physical self. So I think one way to summarize it is when you're born, the starter's pistol goes off, and those planets all start moving at 3 rates of speed. And similar to how Alan Leo wrote about that in the Progressed Horoscope, when that was published in London in 1906, he defined it as a clock of life. And you could say that the fast-moving second hand, or the minor progressions, they work 27 times faster than the secondaries. And then the medium-speed tertiaries are like the middle-speed minute hand of the clock, and they're 13 times faster than the secondaries. And the secondary progressions are like the slow-moving hour hand of the clock. So I think that you have, at all times, you have activity going on in the Progressed Horoscope, which is the unfolding of the capacity of the self that's contained in the natal promise. And that's unfolding physically and in the feelings and desires in the astral plane, and then through the thoughts in the causal plane. And it's all happening simultaneously.
And how does, I liked how you describe, and I'd like you to describe it for the people, about how things go down from the causal plane to the astral.
You know, in my background and training as a disciple on an Eastern spiritual path, I studied the writings of these Indian saints that had pretty much a Hindu or a Sikh or a Muslim background in their spiritual teachings and writings. And they described sort of a vertical descent of spirit into matter, crossing planes of consciousness. And so that's what informed my metaphysical progression theory, was that the causal plane, and for those of us that have meditated and tried to still the mind with either a yogic breathing technique or repeating a mantra at the third eye, we'll know that thoughts will come into our consciousness from the ocean of thought that's what I call the sea of consciousness. And they can just come in, but if you don't pay attention to them, they'll just dissipate and go away, and you can go back to your mantra. But if while you're sitting in meditation, you form an attachment to a thought, it drops down from the causal level to the astral plane and becomes a desire. And then if you act on a desire, it drops down to the physical plane and becomes manifest. So that part of the metaphysical progression theory of the causal, astral, and the physical planes of consciousness was really informed by my discipleship on an Eastern spiritual path and my experiences in my meditation practice.
I always, in my meditations, felt that we have it all backwards in terms of religions, and even the New Age. Everybody's trying to get the hell out of here. Let's go to the next realm; it'll be better. And yet, to me, it feels like we've spent millions of years sort of trying to aim to come here, so that we can actually bring the kingdom of heaven on earth, like you just said. What do you think about that whole concept?
The only way I can make sense out of that, Kelly, and we were talking last night at dinner about our Jupiter-Neptune aspects. You've got the conjunction Haley, and I've got the trine, and Carol has the sextile. I feel that each of the major world religions is represented by a chakra in the body. If you think that Krishna is represented at the eye center, and Buddha at the throat chakra, and Jesus in the heart, and Muhammad in the solar plexus, and then maybe the pagan religions or the Jewish religion in the lower chakras, you'll see that each religion has an orientation and has a belief system that correlates with that particular chakra of the body. So I guess in the West we have a bias towards Christianity as being the royal road, and there is some support for that metaphysically because the heart is the fourth chakra and it's 3 below and 3 above. Excuse me. And so I think that there is some cultural influence in our belief system. And so many people in my generation basically rejected their Christian upbringing and turned to the East and studied systems of spirituality that, as you say, talked about doing your meditation and getting out of here rather than fully embracing your life and opening up the heart to love and serve others. So in some ways you could say the cultural romanticism of the Neptune and Libra generation has distorted the sort of the spirituality of our own culture. And I think it's going to take another couple generations to bring that back to a state of balance.
Yeah, because I really am happy to be here and want to create spiritual visions on the planet. Not just get to, I always tell my Christian friends, so when we get to the feast in heaven, who's going to do the dishes?
That's right. And the other thing, if you stop to think about it, karma goes both ways. I mean, we can be paying off karma that we've created in past lives, but rarely do people talk about planting seeds of good karma that will bear fruit in future lives. Mm-hmm. And that's what I was always kind of perplexed by on that Eastern spiritual path. They talked about doing your meditation and getting out of here and not returning. But I feel that many astrologers signed up centuries ago or millennia ago to reincarnate over and over again to carry the torch of the divine wisdom of astrology forward. Mm-hmm. And I have Uranus conjunct the South Node, and I started having spontaneous astrological recall in 1969 when I was 15 and a half years old. Just these terminologies just came into my mind. Mm-hmm. And I thought, well, everything they said about smoking pot is true here. I'm losing my marbles, and I'm going to have to be locked up pretty soon. I mean, I started hearing things about T-crosses and grand trines, and it's like, where did that come from? Yeah. So I believe that many astrologers that basically remember astrology rather than feel like they're learning it, mm-hmm. fresh and new in this life, it seems to be logical that they've practiced astrology for many past incarnations. And,
yeah. I mean, I started when I was 14 when Uranus crossed my ascendant. Had the great fortune, Jupiter and Saturn crossed the ascendant too. I met 3 great teachers, one being an astrology teacher, and when I was looking at the material, when I was first looking at my chart and she was describing these things, it was like, it was so familiar to me to the point where I was just like, wow, I know this language, And
just like we were talking about, Uranus conjoins the North Node every 15 and a half years, and Uranus also forms conjunctions to the South Node about every 15 and a half years. And I think there are many souls that have a background with astrology that incarnate when Uranus is on either node, because you see that commonly in the charts of career astrologers, or some type of aspect between Uranus and the node. There is a kind of a competition between Mercury, Jupiter, and Uranus as the ruling planet of astrology. Mm-hmm. And in the research of Donna Cunningham and others, it was found that Jupiter was the most common planet to be on the midheaven for professional astrologers. And I think a case can also be made for Mercury and or Uranus to be our ruling planet. And in some charts, you'll see all three prominent. So I guess if you had to say which astrologers are the slam dunk astrologers, they'd be the ones that would have solar aspects to Mercury, Jupiter, and Uranus in the natal chart.
Yeah, when you think about it, Mercury's the storyteller, and that's the storyteller aspect of our work. And then you got, Uranus, the intuitive, oracular connection to the divine mind aspect, and then you got Jupiter, the priest, the one who acts as sort of the physician, the doctor, the PhD, because it takes a scholar to really learn astrology.
That's one thing that I think professional astrologers are underestimated for, is the sophistication of their intellect. My experience, and I've been around astrology now for 37 years, and I've been impressed with the intelligence of astrologers. Sometimes it's a rogue intelligence, sometimes it's what you would call sort of a non-academic intelligence, because many astrologers have high school educations, they didn't get university degrees. Yeah, they got a few rough edges around their minds, but they're bright as heck. They're as intelligent as any PhD out there. And it takes a fine mind to wrap your brain around the complexity of the science of astrology. It's extremely complex. And then to be able to learn it and to then communicate the horoscope to a client, where you're translating these celestial influences into the human experience, takes a very specific type of intelligence to do that, and also a care for people. So I don't think astrologers get enough credit for their intelligence and for their humanitarian concern for the well-being of others. That's one of the things that I wish professional astrology as a field, as a discipline, would identify itself with more, is the level of intelligence that we have amongst our practitioners.
Yeah, I mean, it's like we almost have like an Einsteinian-like intelligence in terms of doing thought experiments and bringing more of the feeling in and the humanitarian concern for humanity. It's like, we're able to think outside the box then,
That eminent British astrologer, Charles Carter, who published 9 or 10 books from 1924 when the Encyclopedia of Psychological Astrology came out, and he was still writing books on political astrology well into the 1940s, 1950s. But some of his classics, like The Astrological Aspects, which was published in 1930, and The Principles of Astrology in 1925, and The Zodiac and the Soul, I think, was from 1928, he wrote about intelligence being found in the horoscope through the solar aspects, contrary to the traditional interpretations of looking at Mercury to define intelligence. And of those close solar aspects, he identified 6, the sextiles and trines, from the Sun to Mars, the Sun to Jupiter, and the Sun to Uranus, were what we call the Mensa Club aspects of raw brain power. So I've used those techniques for years now, and I find many of my colleagues, like yourself, that have a Sun trine Uranus, or you'll find astrologers with Sun sextile Mars, or Sun sextile Jupiter, or Sun trine Jupiter. And those 6 aspects, especially if they're the closest aspect to the Sun, are helpful not only for self-employment in the case of the Mars and Uranus aspects to the Sun, but also to give the person the brain power to crunch through the complexity of astrology as an intellectual discipline.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, with Uranus on the 10th house, it's helped me. I could never work a 9-to-5 job,
No. And you're a pretty bright guy with that Sun-Uranus trine. In fact, you have the same one that CEO Carter has. He was an Aquarian with the Sun trine to Uranus and Libra.
Oh, okay.
So when you take his birth, I think in 1887 he was born, and he died in 1968 at the age of 81. You were born a Uranus cycle after him in 1971 with Uranus back in Libra.
Mm-hmm.
So he was born with that Aquarian Sun in that trine to retrograde Uranus in Libra, the same as you, Kelly.
Nice. How do you, in your journeys through traveling and speaking, and also going to conferences, what has your experience been about the astrological community, and how is this connection with all these interesting people that aren't just astrologers, musicians and artists and all these Renaissance type people?
At this point in my career, I'm 54 years old now and been a full-time professional astrologer for almost 20 years and been an author for 10 years. I've had an incredible opportunity to lecture at over 45 different local astrology groups in 25 states and provinces. I've been invited to speak in Australia and Serbia and Canada and South Africa and all over the U.S. And I've been able to see the U.S., the Canadian, and the international astrological communities at work. And I guess if I had to summarize the beauty and the power of that, I think that the local astrology groups are the backbone of professional astrology. And maybe I'm biased. I have Cancer on the 11th, with Virgo rising, and Uranus in the 11th, trine to Sun Mercury in the 3rd. So I was sort of born to be a traveling lecturer, speaking to astrology groups when you think about that. But what I've noticed is that I'm invited to come in and give a lecture on a Thursday or Friday night, teach a workshop on Saturday, see some local clients on Sunday or on Friday during the day. And sometimes if it's not a multi-city tour where I'm on an extended speaking tour, I'm in and out of this one city probably from Thursday until Sunday night. And I'm hosted in the home of a member of the local astrology group where they put me up in a hotel. And in some places like the Astrological Society of Arizona and Scottsdale, they've invited me back 7, 8, 9 times. And other places in Miami and San Diego, I've lectured there several times. So you get to know them. They feel like family to you, he says, with Cancer on the 11th. And I think what I've experienced is that astrology in the United States is like an extended family. It's a small profession. It used to be you could count on your fingers and toes the full-time professional astrologers in the United States. Now there's quite a few more, but at one time it was maybe you were lucky to find 1 or 2 full-time professionals in each major city in the United States. I think with the younger generation using the internet to attract clientele, there's a much higher percentage of full-time professional astrologers in the younger generation now as there were in the older generations. So I guess if I had to sum up, I would just say that the local astrology groups really, by finding students for the local teaching astrologers, for being a source of clients for the local professional astrologer, and being a vehicle to disseminate astrological knowledge into the community, they're really the heart and soul and the backbone of astrology in this country and in other countries as well.
And weren't you instrumental in creating some kind of
Excuse me.
Standard contract for speaking that astrologers would be honored for their work, traveling speaker like?
Yes, that went back to the UAC conference in Monterey in 1995, and I think the genesis even went back to the ESAR conference in Chicago in 1994. Excuse me, Ray Merriman, the president of the ESAR organization, called together what was termed a President's Council meeting. At this meeting, all of the presidents of the local astrology groups and the teaching astrologers that owned astrology schools met in a special meeting that was convened at that UAC conference in Monterey. And we decided to create a professional astrology speakers bureau. And I was asked by Ray Merriman to become the first national coordinator for it. And what I did was I compiled a database of every local astrology group in the U.S. and Canada. And then I put together a portfolio of lecturers, about 24 to 25 different authors and speakers. And we were trying to connect the astrological authors and lecturers with the local groups to set up speaking tours. So it was a great idea on paper. But when we tried to put it into practice, we found that many of the local astrology groups would have fixed meeting nights, like the second Tuesday of the month, or the third Friday of the month, or the fourth Saturday. And it was a little bit impossible at times to create a tour for a lecturer to go from Annapolis to Washington to Richmond to Norfolk, and to go to all these different cities, for example, and put together a tour because of the meeting nights. But in the end, we made that database of local astrology groups available to whoever who wanted it, and then we circulated the portfolio of lecturers to all the local groups. And at the same time, we created a speaking contract that had a minimum of what's now $150 per lecture and $300 per workshop, or 50% of the gross, whichever is the higher amount. And there was also clauses in that speaking contract for the professional astrologer to be compensated for their travel expenses and to have their lodging and their meals provided for by the local group, and pick up and drop off at the airport. And it kind of became the industry standard for the traveling lecturer within astrology.
Good. Do you have any famous people's charts that you're enamored of?
Well, I like to collect several specialty horoscopes. I like triple conjunctions, people are born with Sun, Mars, Neptune, and Scorpio, like in late October of 1959. And stelliums sometimes are one thing, but I've always kind of kept a little personal collection of triple conjunctions with the Sun, 2 other planets in the Sun.
The triple conjunctions are amazing. I have Jupiter, Neptune, and Mars together in Sagittarius, and you can't ever find anything in a book about all 3.
No, the traditional interpretation of a stellium was 4 planets in the same sign in the same house, and no more than an 8-degree orb, between adjacent planets. And so sometimes people will use dissociate stelliums, where one of the planets is out of sign. And the one guy in the news right now that has one of those is Mike Huckabee, the Republican presidential candidate. He's a 1955 Virgo, and he's got Venus, Mars, and Pluto all triple conjunct at 26 and 28 of Leo, but his sun is at 0 of Virgo. So it is a stellium by orb, but he's got the sun out of sign. So I pay attention to those type of charts. I think those individuals have a lot of power and a lot of focus when they have either a triple conjunction or a stellium like that.
Yeah, like the I've seen like people that have like say 5 planets in one sign, almost become very chameleon like, the Mercury effect I call it, because if you have Mars conjunct Venus, it's like Mars is in Taurus and Libra, and Venus is like it's in Scorpio and Aries. So you get all these little ting 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 cross combinations that make the person able to do anything or be anything and shapeshift.
One of the astrologers that's really done some good research in this area is Donna Cunningham. She's written several articles for the Mountain Astrologer, and she used the Astro Databank astrology software program to comb through thousands of horoscopes of celebrities and then pick out the ones that had the Venus-Neptune aspects or the Venus-Pluto aspects or the Venus-Uranus aspects. And so just in the last 6 to 7 years, we've come up with added features in Solar Fire or Kepler or in the IO edition for the Macintosh or the other astrology programs that allow you to sort through thousands of chart files and then pick out like criteria. And then
there's the Astro Databank.
And that one is kind of the grandmother of them all. So Lois Rodden, when she was collecting that data and just recording it manually on index cards, I mean, that was a manual collection of data that probably spanned over 30 years before it was built into that software program. But Donna Cunningham did some really good work where she would take a specific aspect, or she would talk about specific generational factors in astrology, like the Uranus-Neptune square or the Saturn-Neptune conjunction, and then point out how astrologers that were born with those outer planet aspects would express their astrology in a certain way. So I think we need more research like that. I think astrologers, if they want to live up to their capacity as a professional practicing astrologer, they kind of need to know what their generational karma is and how they can make their contribution to the profession based on where they were born in the outer planet cycles. And so for me, I really identify with that waning square of Uranus and Neptune that I was born with in November of 53. And Rujar always said that that 270-degree square was the seed point for the subsequent cycle. So I feel that the generation of astrologers that are really going to be able to relate to my work are the souls that were born in the early to middle 1990s at the Uranus-Neptune conjunction. So I'm kind of waiting for them to grow up, and then maybe some of my books will start to sell a little better, because I think I was writing stuff that's a little bit ahead of the curve or something. So.
Well, I love your work. And I'm a 1971er, but I was born in that generation. It was Pluto in last degrees Virgo, but Neptune in Sag.
Yes. And then you've got that once every 13-year Jupiter-Neptune conjunction, which is, when you think about it, being a spiritual filmmaker, and trying to portray astrology to the public in a positive spiritual light.
In his 12th house, yeah.
It's just fabulous.
12th house needs a better rap. I call it the house of spiritual visions.
Yeah. We were talking at dinner last night, Kelly, about how strong your Jupiter is. It's your ruler. It's dignified in Sag. It's accidentally dignified in the 12th, and it's a soul and final dispositor. I mean, that's a kick-ass Jupiter. That's about as strong as it gets.
Should have seen me on the football field.
I can imagine that.
I broke the sack record.
What, did you eat quarterbacks for lunch? Is that what it was?
Pretty much. I always felt like I could fly, so I would just like jump over the blockers,
Yeah.
They didn't know I could jump that, but I was an all-state pole vaulter.
Yeah.
And I just always felt like I could just,
yeah.
And I high jumped and I did the hurdles, big old horse doing the hurdles. I ran a 4.540, so
That's quick.
It was quick.
Yeah.
But I have a healthy respect for the body, mind, spirit connection.
Mm-hmm.
And if anything, that astrology's taught me is that there's a transcendent intelligence in the universe,
mm-hmm.
putting archetypes into bodies. And I think that it could be an argument for God,
mm-hmm.
that there is a divine intelligence. It's funny to talk to a Christian and say, it's because of my astrology enterprise that I believe in God.
I have experienced firsthand the condemnation of astrology and of myself as a career astrologer from the religious community and individuals within that community. And you can sit there and try to reason with some of the evangelical Christians that it was the Magi that saved the baby Jesus from King Herod as they advised Joseph and Mary to flee to Egypt. You can take them to Genesis chapter 1, verses 14 to 18 and talk about the creation story, how God put lights in the firmaments to mark the time and mark the seasons. And you can try to explain to people that the Vatican has the largest astrology library on the face of the earth, and certain monastic orders within the Roman Catholic Church were exclusively limited to the ones that could study astrology. But I think when somebody has a belief system, especially one that they adopted or absorbed as a child, it's very difficult for them to think outside of that. And sometimes I think when astrologers argue with the skeptics, whether they're academic, scientific, or religious, it sometimes does more harm than good for astrology. It seems that when astrologers focus more on uplifting each other through collegial respect and support, through positive outreach to the community by educating the public on the good that astrology does, and basically detach a little bit from the criticism coming at us from the skeptics in the academic and the religious and the scientific communities, I think the net result is that we're better off.
Yeah.
There's a lot of wasted energy and a lot of anger and disruption to people's peace of mind that happens when they try to attack the skeptics and make the situation worse.
Yeah, I wrote my main article, Biblical Insights into Astrology, as a sort of a personal quest, to really see what was in there about astrology. And it's interesting because, the only negative things against astrology is like during the Hebrew captivity, when God says that nothing can save you from the fire, Nebuchadnezzar, because he's trying to free his people, not even your astrologers. But and Christians use that all over about the condemnation of astrology, and yet it's really condemning Babylonian, omen-based, fatalistic, deterministic astrology of that day, not modern psychological astrology, which is a whole new invention. It's kind of like saying the Bible is against microwave ovens. They weren't even around,
Yes.
In this new synthesis that we have. And I wrote that article, and I actually have Christians. One called me last week when I was watching a football game. I got a message saying from a Christian who said, they were from the seminary and they had a degree in the Bible, and she was doing research on astrology in the Bible, and they had a very negative view of astrology, she said, but she came across the article and read it, and she said it totally transformed her way of thinking about astrology. She says she was so happy to have such an illumination about what it's really for and about, and so we can have some positive change. At the same time, I know what you're saying, don't get caught up in making your life fight the skeptics,
Yes. If you think about Neptune's transit through Aquarius from 1998 to 2012 and how we're trying to dissolve the resistance in the scientific community, which is ruled by Aquarius, I think that when Neptune ingresses into Pisces and then spends the next 14 years there, 2011, 2012, and then for the next 14 years, I think there'll be a dissolving of the resistance within the religious communities. So it's almost like one thing at a time. Neptune, in its 14-year sojourn through these, especially these last signs of the zodiac, has really taken, I guess, the level of astrology and how it sort of permeates into the community. If I had to pick the two planets that work in tandem to show how astrology as a profession is moving out into the world at large, I would look at the twin transits of Uranus and Neptune. And I think that as Neptune transited through Capricorn, and that would have been from 1984 till 1998, astrology was professionalized. And we really established pretty much a foundation of astrology as a viable profession. Now, as Neptune is spending these 14 years transiting through Aquarius, we're trying to dissolve some of the boundaries in the scientific condemnation of astrology as a body of knowledge. And I'm very excited to see what we're going to experience as a profession when Neptune ingresses into Pisces, and have almost a spiritual renaissance of astrology taking its rightful place side by side with spiritual understanding and religious understanding.
Hopefully this video will help.
I think it will.
Yeah.
And for a guy like you with a Jupiter-Neptune conjunction in Sag, sometimes individuals incarnate to be exemplars, where larger collective forces have to pass through an individual human personality in order to find manifestation in the world. And your progressed Mercury, just having gone to the cardinal point of 0 Aries, right in the time that the movie is coming out, in May at UAC, I think this is very, very indicative of what you've done. You've taken something out of the realm of abstraction, Mercury progressing through a mutable sign, and then hitting that Aries point, and now the movie is ready to come out. I think the impact of this is going to be felt for many years.
And I think this generation that's coming in and incarnating on the planet now with Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, and even Chiron in the last 4 signs, the transcendent signs. They talk about the indigo children. It's like, how many generations have come on the planet with Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, and Chiron all in the last 4 signs? Not that the last 4 signs are better. They just symbolize the connection between the I and the thou,
It may be that it's a wave of old souls that have had multiple incarnations, and one way we could try to understand that with the metaphysical theory is that when a majority of the outer planets are in these last four universal signs of the zodiac, it could be that the souls that incarnate at that time on Earth are ones that have had multiple previous incarnations, and they're what we call the, quote, older souls. Mm-hmm. I did some research about the previous Uranus-Neptune conjunction in the early 1820s, and when the souls that were born during that influence got into their adult years in the middle 1840s at the discovery of Neptune, excuse me, there was a huge explosion of demonstration of clairvoyance and mediumship and psychic and spiritual ability. Mm-hmm. So I think those children that were born around the Uranus-Neptune conjunction of February of 1993, and the oldest ones now are getting to be about 15 years old. In a few more years, and especially when Neptune ingresses into Pisces in 2012, I think we may see public displays of spirituality, clairvoyance, trance mediumship that we haven't seen since the middle of the 19th century, the last time that Neptune was leaving Aquarius and going into Pisces.
Maybe some of that surrealistic or impressionistic artistic stuff in the 1800s again.
It would sure probably impact music and the arts and literature, I would think, yeah.
Wow, is there anything I should ask you that I don't know to ask you, because I don't know everything about you?
Well, I suppose what's left in the remainder of my career, when I got the cancer diagnosis, the sort of the four planets in Scorpio fatalist of me thinks, oh, I'll be dead in a month, so what am I going to do now? And then the idealist of me, with Jupiter on the midheaven and Pisces moon, I still think, oh, I got a lot of years left. There's so much more I want to contribute to the profession. I think that astrology is right on the verge of overcoming some obstacles to its wider acceptance by the public. What's happened on the internet in the last 12 years in making horoscopic astrology more understood by the public, going way beyond sun sign horoscope columns, and having individuals able to go to certain websites and calculate the full nativity and understand that beyond the sun there's the moon and all the other planets. And I think we're almost getting to a point of critical mass where the exposure of astrology to the public over the internet, if we could just now steer that into television, film, and other forms of media, we might overcome this resistance to astrology. All the statistical research that is done about the percentage of people that read their horoscope columns in the newspaper and express an interest in astrology is always over 35%, sometimes as much as 40 to 45%.
I've heard like 50 million in this country alone.
So there's a sort of a receptive mass consciousness.
And they're waiting for something deeper.
And I think that what we have to do is represent the profession with honor and dignity. The main problem that many astrologers that are involved in the national organizations have discussed for years now is that we can't control who calls himself an astrologer. So anybody from a 1-900 psychic line, charging $3.99 a minute, to a full-time professional self-employed astrologer that's been practicing for 40 years, at both ends of the spectrum, they can still call themselves an astrologer. We don't have any control over it as a professional practice.
Yeah, that's why the parable of the filmmaking will help to dissolve that view of the astrologer as being the psychic, and the know things, from a place of just psychic, even tarot cards. I don't even like being associated with that. I mean, even though I like tarot cards in my exploration of metaphysics, I don't like being associated with anything but pure astrology,
That's one of the things that I felt very strongly about, was to be strictly and solely a full-time self-employed astrologer without having any other source of income, without any other discipline that I practice. And sometimes it felt like you were the last of a dying breed, because up until recent years with the internet, it was very difficult to make a full-time living as an astrologer, especially through clientele income alone. It just fluctuated too much in order to be able to have a steady income.
Yeah, luckily I was down in Key West in 1994 at the age of 21 when I started, and I had an influx of like 6 different airplanes coming in per day,
Yes.
So it was just like, when you build a reputation as being the island astrologer, and I recommend that most beginning astrologers go to a tourist town and do high quality work. Within a year you'll be the island astrologer, and that way you'll have a steady stream of clients coming to that zone,
There is a business model that any young person that wants to become a full-time self-employed astrologer can follow that. If you're living in a city, you can become the in-house astrologer at a metaphysical bookstore. You can go be the in-house astrologer at some kind of health spa or health resort. Like you did, you could move to a small destination tourist town and establish a public presence there. And if you're meticulous about recording the names and addresses and phone numbers of your clientele in a database and sending out either emails or a physical mailing. You can build up a full-time professional practice, certainly within 12 years, but most likely within 6 years, half a Jupiter cycle. I think it takes a full 12 years for an astrology practice to mature, the length of the Jupiter cycle, which rules the professions.
Yeah, it took me 3 years to build up a full-time practice, but it took 12 years before I was inspired to write an entire book on astrology. A teaching, I'd say.
And then what was probably common in our profession was that no professional astrologers ever talked freely about how much money they made, what their gross income was, what their expenses were.
I'm glad you did that in the third book.
The whole purpose of that was to break the taboo about discussing money. And I even included spreadsheets of my income and expenses in Volume 3, just to show, A, that net income is not the same as gross income. So don't get fooled going into self-employment, thinking you're going to keep every dollar of your gross income. You're going to have a lot of expenses going out the door as well. And also to give the young people a concrete sense of just what you could expect to make as an astrologer, as well as learning how to pay your estimated quarterly taxes and how much money you should spend on marketing and advertising and
setting your fees.
Setting your fees.
Very practical book. Thank you.
Thanks for that verbal rising, because I have no planets on Earth, so that was saving grace.
Yeah. Well, anything else you want to say, or if you feel done?
No, I just want to thank Moses Sirigar especially for having the vision and the courage to organize and promote and produce the Blast Conference. I think what he did to showcase the younger generation of astrologers with their command of technique and their understanding of our heritage traditions, the Hellenistic and the medieval legacy, I think has been a tremendous gift to the profession. And it also served to boost the confidence of these 20-something and 30-something astrologers. Now they feel that they're more part of the mainstream of the profession. And I know there's been some discussion about the relatively few young astrologers that are speaking at UAC, but we are having another Blast Conference, in the fall of 2008, where they'll be able to present their material again. So I think that yourself and Moses and several of these other younger astrologers that are stepping in and taking these leadership roles now within the profession, it's a very positive thing, and just very happy to see it. So congratulations, you guys.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I'm so excited about Moses' whole journey with the Blast. It's like the next wave, the next wave of the third wave, which is usually a synthesis of the first two waves from the 70s and then the 80s, 90s. So we'll see how that flows,
One way we could wrap up in understanding that was the Uranus North Node conjunction in 1976, which marked the beginning of the depth psychology era with the publication of Liz Green and Stephen Arroyo and Robert Hand and Donna Cunningham and Tracy Marx's books. That defined the astrological paradigm until the next Uranus North Node conjunction in 1991 in Capricorn, where we went back to our roots and researched our heritage and our traditions through the translation of the Arabic and the Latin and the Hellenistic texts. But that period has run its course now, and we're in a new paradigm with the Uranus North Node Mercury conjunction in Pisces.
And my next book is called The Tao of Astrology.
And I think this is where the young astrologers, because Mercury wound up conjoining the Uranus North Node conjunction, they are really carrying the torch for the next 15 and a half years. And that conjunction, if you track that cycle, and I went all the way back to the days of Alan Leo and Charles Carter in the early 20th century, just like clockwork, it defines the chapters of astrology every 15 and a half years. And it seems to make perfect sense that Uranus is the future and the North Node of astrology. And if you look at both Uranus and the North Node having a future orientation, and if you think of them conjoining once every 15 and a half years, you can see how the future of astrology is seated at those times.
It's funny, one of the first videos I put up was Stephen Forrest at NORWAC talking about the future of astrology. And it's interesting, too, that it's in Pisces this time, because film, video on the net,
And maybe a marriage of astrology as a discipline side by side with some of the other creative arts, where it shows up more in literature and in music and in film.
I'm like Jodie Forrest. I'm passionate about making those characters with charts and really fleshing them out with astrology. It's fun. It's exciting.
So I just want to wish you the best with completing the film project. I know you're trying to cut it all down to 2.5 hours and then debut it at UAC, and I hope we fill up the hall with everybody there watching the movie for the first time. So,
well, thank you so much for coming to the house and everything.
You're welcome.